Oh, everybody's coming in. Hi, world. We're waiting for attendees to click up. We'll get started in just a minute. It's fun. I don't know if any of you have ever done webinars through Zoom, but what's happening right now is we've got Sarah Payne and Dylan Schwint down in Colorado. I'm in Montana. And I'm sitting here watching everybody who's been queuing, waiting to come in, and now all the numbers are just ticking up to 50, 51. It's going up and up. So it's sort of fun to watch. Got 2 more minutes. So I'll let people trickle in. Hello, Facebook. I'm told we're live on Facebook. Pretty exciting. It's my first Facebook Live experience. We're still waiting 1 more minute until everybody trickles in, and then we'll get started, all right? All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for coming this evening to Crow Canyon's first ever live webinar. This is something we've been wanting to do for a very long time. So I'm really excited that we're doing this and that you are all here with us. We had incredible response to a Friday night lecture. So thank you for being here. I'm Kyle Bocinsky. I'm the director of the Research Institute at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And I'm also a research scientist at the Montana Climate Office. I'm talking to you tonight from Missoula, Montana, from my home in Missoula. And we're going to be talking about Southwestern climates and cultures, looking at how changing climates have impacted societies in the past, present, and future. I want to thank you all for making this possible. We've been asked to start doing more online content for a long time, and it just took a while for us to be able to have the capacity to do it. But thanks to you, thanks to our contributors, thanks to everybody and our participants in our programs, you've really made this happen. And I especially want to thank my 2 co-hosts this evening, Dylan Schwint, our director of IT down in Cortez, Colorado, and Sarah Payne, who is our chief outreach officer and the director of cultural explorations. Dylan and Sarah are on. Do you guys want to turn on your video real quick and wave, just so people can see you? Hi Dylan, Sarah. All right. They'll be in the background, and we're actually going to be, doing this through Zoom video conferencing. You all are here, and I want to give you some tips. First tip is that I'm sharing my screen right now, so you all should be seeing something that says Zoom video conferencing on the top. If you've got a little box with my head in it and it's in your way, you can click a minimize button, or you can drag it to move it around. So if my head is in your way, move my head. You can ask questions at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over your screen, you should see a little bar at the bottom that reads chat, raise hand, and Q&A. If you click the Q&A button, go ahead and ask a question. Sarah will be monitoring those questions throughout the talk. And if it's pertinent to what I'm talking about right then, and it seems like we really need to answer it, she'll let me know. And otherwise, I'll answer a lot of questions at the end. We're going to try to get to everybody's questions. Also, if you're having difficulties with Zoom, you can head over to our live stream on our Facebook page. So facebook.com/Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. It's a mouthful. Don't forget the AEO. All right. I want to introduce Crow Canyon really quick for anybody joining us who is unfamiliar or hasn't been to campus. Crow Canyon's mission is to empower present and future generations by making the past accessible and relevant. And we do that in 3 ways. The first way is we do archaeological research. We've got a almost 40-year-old research program going on looking at some of the most important cultural sites in Southwestern Colorado. We've been deepening the knowledge of Southwestern prehistory. We do that with participants, with the public, through experiential education. We invite the public to join us in that archaeological exploration, and we offer programs for all ages. We offer programs in lab, programs in excavation, programs that travel and bring you to new and incredible places. And we do all of this in concert with American Indian partners and using American Indian knowledge when appropriate. So we're trying to base our research in place-based wisdom, in the long-term wisdom of the past that comes from being in a place for a long time. And I direct the Research Institute at Crow Canyon, which is an extension of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center that really focuses on expanding Crow Canyon's research capacity. We do this in 5 ways. We enhance Crow Canyon's mission-driven activities by supporting those activities. We invest in Crow Canyon staff research and strategic goals. So individual projects that our staff members do, we try to support that through the Research Institute. We engage world-class research associates in Crow Canyon. We have a network of over 20 research associates across the United States and actually around the world who are participating in Crow Canyon's research either on campus or through research collaborations with our incredible staff. We're stewarding Crow Canyon's data legacy. We've been developing a new database for Crow Canyon's, for the data that Crow Canyon has gathered over the last 40 years. And we're rolling out tools to make those data more accessible to classrooms, to descendant communities, and to scholars. And we're serving Native nations through collaboration. We really focus on meaningful collaboration with descendant communities in the Southwest. I'm looking forward to showing you that. So here's our roadmap for this evening. We're going to be looking at 3 different themes. The first theme is change. Change is universal in the past. So I want to talk a bit about maize, corn, and migration in the Pueblo Southwest and some of the things that we've learned at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Then we'll be talking about adaptation. I'm going to talk about 2 really neat projects that we've been doing in the Research Institute at Crow Canyon. The Pueblo Farming project, which is looking at the legacy of 2,000 years of Hopi farming and seeing how that corn grows today. And we're going to be documenting the diversity, the historic diversity of mainly ancestral Pueblo, but really all Southwest corn through the Maize database project. And finally, I want to talk about community resilience and a really great project we've been collaborating on called Native Waters on Arid Lands. So let's dive into it. The first project really focuses on work from a group called the Village Ecodynamics Project. And this is that team right here. And I want to call out a few important people in the work that I'm going to be showing you tonight. Mark Varian, who is the Executive Vice President of the Research Institute, is there on the left. I hope people can see my pointer. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Paul Armgiati is there up at the top and actually leads our Pueblo Farming project that I'll be talking about later. And Tim Kohler, who's faculty at Washington State University, and was really the brainchild of this big project I'm going to be presenting. But it was a team effort with researchers from many different universities and many different research groups. Just to give you a little background on the Pueblo Southwest and the 4 corners, if you're unfamiliar with it, we're going to be talking about this region right here. At the corners of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. We call it the Mesa Verde region or the Northern San Juan. this is the region where the ancestral Pueblo people first brought farming, agriculture, corn agriculture, into the northern Southwest. There are some major cultural changes, and we're only going to touch on those during this talk. But one of the most dramatic was a migration, where people left this region of the Four Corners Southwest and moved to points south and east, down to present day, around present day Santa Fe and the Rio Grande Valley, and then the villages of Hopi and Acoma and Zuni. Today, there are 21 Pueblos across the Southwest and in North Texas, speaking 4 different major language groups and representing a huge amount of cultural diversity, and still growing corn and participating in traditional lifeways today. And so a lot of the knowledge that I'm going to be sharing with you is actually knowledge that has been shared with me from our collaborators in Pueblo communities today. The Village Ecodynamics Project, which is sort of ended, but was a 20-year research collaboration focused on 2 major study areas. The first was up here in southwestern Colorado around Mesa Verde National Park, Canyons of the Ancients National Monument, and Canyon Archaeological Center, which is right where my cursor is, if you can see that. And the second area was here in the northern Rio Grande, around modern day Santa Fe, Los Alamos National Park, and Bandelier National Monument. And this was one of the main sources and sinks of migration at the late 1200s. People moved from our southwestern Colorado, the Four Corners area, to the northern Rio Grande. The study that I want to talk to you about is really about reconstructing climate. And one of the main ways that we do that in the Southwest is through the study of tree rings. This is A.E. Douglas, a picture from the Arizona State Museum, but this big piece of wood is at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona today. Douglas created this method of dating archaeological sites using tree ring widths. And it's a pretty simple thing. It's something that we've actually all done. If you've ever seen the cross-section of a tree, you know that you can count tree rings to tell the age of some trees. We can also look at the variable widths of those rings to tell something about the past. One thing we can say is about climate. So we can know, for example, that wide rings are years when trees are happy. These are happy tree years. And they're wet or warm years, depending on what is restricting that tree's growth. Narrow rings are cool or dry years. These are hard years for the tree. So looking at networks of these trees from across the Southwest, we're able to identify when trees were happy and therefore wet and warm, or when they were sad, cool and dry. There's actually a huge number of these trees and tree ring chronologies, series of wet and warm or cool and dry years that have been established across the Southwest over the last 100 years or so. And in this map that I've got here, what I'm showing you is actually all of the tree ring chronologies that have been developed over the last 100 years. Is about 205 chronologies here. And I'm only showing them to you from 3 different main species of trees or groups of trees. The green dots here are pinyon and juniper. So these are trees that like to grow in lower elevations, and they're more constrained. Their growth is constrained by how much precipitation they get during their growing season. The blue and the red dots are in higher elevations. Blue is Douglas fir, red is spruce, pines, and true firs. And these are trees that are responding mainly to temperature changes, although some of them can respond to precipitation as well. So if a tree ring scientist wanted to reconstruct climate across the Southwest, they might pick a couple of places where they want to do some reconstruction, say where I've got these triangles here: Cortez, Mesa Verde National Park, Espanola, New Mexico, and Los Alamos. And a tree ring scientist would choose some trees that they think are the best trees to do a reconstruction of, say, precipitation over the last 2,000 years. They might choose for our area of the Four Corners, for Southwestern Colorado, trees that are water limited. So they're choosing trees that are pinyon and juniper trees in this case. Down in Espanola and Los Alamos, we don't have as many pinyon and junipers, but we also have different climate patterns. We've got climate patterns that are really influenced in the summer by the monsoon system. So people might choose trees that are capturing those monsoonal patterns. Well, that's fine for 4 different places across the landscape. But what if we wanted to estimate what the climate would have been like, how much rain we might have had, or how cool it might have been over a much longer period and over a lot of different places? Well, colleagues up at Washington State University and I developed a method to do that. And we first did it for our 2 VEP study areas. The maps flashing before your eyes are reconstructions for Southwestern Colorado. This is the Ute Mountains and Mesa Verde National Park. And then for our Northern Rio Grande study area. So this is the Maize Mountains, which is an old volcano. It looks sort of like a volcano there, you can see that. And Los Alamos is down here. And then Santa Fe would be down in the valley here. And we've got 2 reconstructions. On the left, what you're seeing is a reconstruction of water year precipitation. So this is October to September throughout the year, and it's the amount of precipitation in centimeters. I'll tell you about the thresholds in a second. On the right is a measure of temperature, but it's in a sort of odd way of looking at temperature called growing degree days. It's literally the amount of heat that's accumulated during the growing season, and it's really important to corn. The colored ramps that I'm showing you are when it's wet enough or dry enough for corn on the left. Green is wet, red to yellow is dry. So if it's green, those are places where it's wet enough for corn to grow really well. On the right, where it's red, those are places where it's warm enough for corn to grow really well. And in the middle, what we've done is we've taken both of these reconstructions and overlaid them to say, where are the most likely places where you could grow corn in any given year over the last 2,000 years? So we did a 2,000-year reconstruction. What I'm showing you here is only from AD 600 into the 1300s. And what we see is how variable maize productivity might have been across this landscape over time. But we can look at trends. People aren't really, they're reacting to what's happening every year. You might have a good year, you might have a bad year. But when they're choosing where to live, they're actually looking at where they're gonna be successful a lot of the time, right? So we know where people were living, and we're wondering, were they choosing places where they were really successful? Here's the Northern Rio Grande study area, and what you see here on this map is in red, all of the places where we have high densities of archaeological sites, habitation sites in the past. And what you can see is that area around Los Alamos National Labs, which we call the Pajarito Plateau, was really a hotbed for people living in this area. And what we found when we did this analysis and sort of crunched it through time is that people were living in high densities in the places that were the best places to grow corn. It's not necessarily surprising. It's sort of a boring result if you think about it. But we found that they were choosing to live in places like up on Mesa Verde National Park, and in the Great Sage Plain and the Miguelmo Dome area. They were living in large villages where they were able to grow corn upwards of 80 to 90% of the years over the last 2,000 years. And when they moved down to the Northern Rio Grande area, they set up shop in places where they were able to do the same. They set up shop right there on the Pajarito Plateau. Pajarito Plateau on the left-hand side of the Northern Rio Grande area, where they had high probabilities of being able to grow corn, upwards of 80 to 90% of the time. Later on, they moved into large villages and started doing irrigation and actually many other different really cool technologies for growing corn. But when they first moved down there, they looked for the place where they could keep on keeping on. They looked for that place where they could keep growing corn. So we took this method that we'd done for these two study areas, and really that represents about 21,000 different places across the landscape. And we decided to try it for all of the Four Corners Southwest. We did it for 2.1 million places across the landscape, because we wanted to look at more than just these two study areas, and we wanted to compare the results of this maize niche analysis with a different way of thinking about the past, and that's through tree ring dates. So what you're seeing here are all of the archaeological sites for which we had tree ring dates. So I was talking about tree rings as being thermometers and rain gauges, right? Where trees, happy trees are growing more, happy, warm, wet trees are growing more in their growing seasons, and sad, cool, dry trees are growing less. Well, archaeologists use that to do paleoclimate reconstructions, but we also use that to date sites. We can actually take a beam from an archaeological site, and by looking at the sequence of warm and wet and cool and dry years, we can establish the cutting year or near to it of that beam. We know when that building was constructed or when a construction episode happened within that building. So here we pulled together a network of 30,000 or so, 29,316 of these tree ring dates from AD 1500 on, or 8500 on, including 10,490 of the best dates. These are dates for which we know that tree was cut down in the last year of its growth. We've got about 4,000 near cutting dates, and then 15,000 of what are called non-cutting dates, trees for which we don't have the outer ring. We don't know exactly when the tree died, and it could have died in near that year or any year afterwards. And they represent 1,003 archaeological sites. So we wanted to compare these two really massive data sets, 30,000 dates and 2.1 or so million places across the landscape where we've done these climate reconstructions. And we did the same thing: water year precipitation and growing season, growing degree days, that measure of heat, and we thresholded them to create a niche. And these were the two main series that we came up with, the two big graphs. Now these are complicated graphs, and I don't want you to belabor them too much. I'm not going to, because they're a bit confusing, but there's two big patterns that I want you to see out of this. The first pattern is in the top graph. My mouse has disappeared, so I'm just gonna have to describe everything to y'all, unfortunately. So in the top graph, what we see is through time from AD 500 to 1400, I think going that way on your screen, hopefully. From AD 500 to 1400, the number of places across the landscape for which we have tree ring dates. And we see a major pattern here of 4 peaks in dates through time that get larger as we go through time. These are peaks not in population necessarily, but in construction of habitation sites. So what we see are people building a lot, and then periods where we don't have a lot of construction. Now, why would we maybe not have as much construction? Well, one thing is sampling. Archaeologists, we've been drawn to big sites. We're drawn to the sites that we can see on the landscape. We, like all primates, are into patterns. So we look at where we think people are gonna live. That's where we look for archaeological sites. And sometimes that's not where people are choosing to live. And so, so my co-authors and I on this study were really looking at what could be compelling people to change where they were building sites. And we interpreted this graph as being periods of what we called exploration and exploitation. And that was exploration and exploitation of particular environmental and social niches, ways of being a community. So during the first part of each of those peaks, when we were sort of in troughs, right? Those are periods where people are exploring new niches. They're exploring new places to grow corn. They're exploring new ways to organize their communities. They might be living out in small villages or even hamlets or even solo out on the landscape, growing corn. And then during those periods of peaks, we know those are periods when we have some of the largest aggregations and largest construction that happens in the Southwest. These are the periods when you get during the mid to late 1000s and 1100s, the peak of the Chacoan phenomenon, where we have construction of places like Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon, and the expansion of what we call the Chacoan system exploding out onto the landscape. And then we have during the final period, the Pueblo III period, we've got the incredible cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, when people are constructing these incredible habitations right in alcoves, in alcove sites. Then down on this bottom graph, we've got something very different. This is the percent of those places that are actually in the maize farming niche at any given time. So this is, you can think of it as a graph of booms and busts in agriculture throughout time. And the important line here is the one that's got colors all around it, the white line with colors all around it. And what that is the pattern of booms and busts where people are living. Because it doesn't matter to me if I'm a farmer and there's a drought 100 kilometers away and nobody's living there that I might be trading with. That might not matter to me very much so long as I'm doing okay or the people that I'm trading with are doing okay. But it really matters to us what's happening, where people are living. And what's nice about our method here is that we were able to establish what was happening where people were living. And what we see is the dramatic impacts. I see two patterns here. The dramatic impacts of some of those classic droughts that we've talked about in the Southwest. One that happens in the mid 1100s that you see there, that sort of is the division line between the Pueblo II, the period right around 1100, where we get one of these major exploration or exploitation periods. And then Pueblo III, that period of exploration, we get a big drought there, a mega drought even. And then we've got a famous one that happens in the late 1200s. And that's really where we see the depopulation, the migrations out of the central Mesa Verde region. That's one thing to see. But the other thing to see is actually, I think, a little more interesting. And it's that generally this white line in the bottom is sloping, it's trending downwards. It's trending that direction, I think, because people are being forced into, populations growing, people are being forced into occupying places of the landscape that aren't as optimal for growing corn. These are corn farmers, they know where it's good to grow corn. And they're having to move into those places that are less optimal as their populations are growing. And during those bad times, which are bad, but you can see there's a lot of bad times that happened across the Southwest. During those bad times, something happened in their societies where they said, nope, we're going to change what we're doing. We're going to go into one of these exploration periods, or ultimately, at the end of the 1200s, it's time to leave this region and start someplace new. This last video that I want to show you is a different way of looking at exactly the same data. What I'm showing you up top, you can think of it as a map of where it's good to grow corn and where it's bad through time. The good places are the high, dark places. So those are places where you're getting enough rain and where it's warm enough generally to grow corn. And it's actually a map of the number of years straight that it's been good to grow corn. And we know that, that from the archaeological record, we can estimate the amount of storage that people had. We think they had about 3 to 4 years of storage at any given time. They had that much capacity. But that means that if you had a string of more than 3 bad years or 4 bad years, that was tough. Those were really tough times. And those are the sort of valleys or deserts in this map. The dots that are floating on top are those tree ring dates. The bigger the dot, the more dates. So these are places where people are building. And what you'll notice is, unsurprisingly, that people are building in those places where they really are in those dark, consistent, high, good maize growing places over long periods of time. What we're seeing right now in sort of the middle of your screen, or what we saw, was the fluorescence of Chaco Canyon, which actually in our models turns out to be a pretty neat place to grow corn for an extended period of time. And then it crashes and people end up leaving Chaco Canyon. My colleagues, especially Tim Kohler, we've spent hours watching this map and looping it over and over and over again. And you should try it after this talk when we post the video, because there's a lot to be learned by just thinking through these patterns of where people have lived and where they were building their buildings and how their fortunes were changing in terms of corn. So what are the ultimate findings that we have out of this series of studies? First, it's that migration, exchange, and cultural transition were the norm in the Pueblo past. These weren't just one-off experiences that people had. People were routinely changing, seeking new ways to occupy their social and environmental niches. They were always innovating. In fact, we think that we've documented major transformations that occurred at least 4 times in the Pueblo past, and that these transitions, they don't necessarily occur with every shift in the climate system. It's not always during droughts that these transitions are occurring. Rather, we find that they tend to occur with changes in environmental uncertainty. In fact, it's those periods when you've been vigilant in making sure that you're able to store for 3 or 4 years, and then that amount of storage isn't holding it together anymore. So I've been talking about the past, but a lot of the work that we've been doing at Crow Canyon has actually been focused on the present and focused on the future. The first project that I want to talk to you about is focused on adaptation and people's adaptation of maize over the last 2,000 years. And it's the Pueblo Farming project. This is a collaboration that we undertook with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. Ooh, I'm getting a signal here and I'm trying to click it, sorry. Mouse isn't working, there we go. Oh, I've got a Facebook question. Okay, sorry, let me go back and I'll answer it just because we're here. Looking at this chart, so Rick says, looking at this chart, one must conclude that many climate changes have and will continue to occur naturally. Just asking. That's absolutely true, that we have had some major transformations in the past. And that's one of the things that we're focused on studying at Crow Canyon, which is how communities have adapted to those changes in the past, because we know that that changes are going to be happening in the future as well. So we really want to be able to use those past experiences and learn from those past experiences when they're shared with us to help plan for the future. So thanks, Rick. So I was saying we decided to create a project with the Cultural Preservation Office at Hopi, looking at the development of Hopi corn over millennia. So at Hopi today, there are over 20 different named varieties of corn. Many of them are named for the colors of the corn, but they all have important ritual, traditional, and culinary purposes. Each one has their own role in Hopi society today. This is a real unique thing. And what we found in this project is that at Hopi, there's more diversity in corn, both genetically and in terms of variability, the sort of colors and everything, than in any other single community around the world. It's a real incredible thing. That corn has been brought to Hopi and developed over 2,000 years. And the Hopi consider, and we think they're absolutely right, that Mesa Verde was one of the homelands for at least some of the clans that ended up at the Hopi Mesas. And so the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office was interested in how it came to be that they had all this variety and how their corn would grow in their homeland today. As an archaeologist, I'm interested in how this type of diversity comes into being. And so I want to share with you one way of thinking about how diversity is maintained within a population, in this case, a population of corn. And this is what we call a heuristic model. This is a story about how that variation might be maintained. At Hopi, women do the selection. They pick the corn that's going to be grown for their community and for their household every summer. That corn that they select for growing is called the pushumi. And they're choosing that corn based on the ritual and subsistence needs of their community and their household, and based on the ecological knowledge, what corn would grow well. That corn represents a sample, you could say, of a population of the corn, of the variability of corn that's held at that place. And that's planted. And through ritual forcing, prayer, behavioral forcing, cultivation practices, and environmental forcing, climate, soil, how much rain comes, when the monsoons come, a different sample of corn germinates and grows and produces seed than happened the last year. So you get slightly different corn out than what you put in terms of amounts. That corn is harvested. It gets mixed with stored corn. The current harvest might get mixed with stored corn. You've got previous harvests that come in. You might have some traded corn in certain societies. And then corn gets used for trade, for ritual, for feasting, for food. And then this whole series of events repeats itself. And something that my colleagues and I are interested in is the ways in which those ritual and subsistence and food, so the ritual and subsistence needs of the community serve to maintain that diversity through time. The Hopi Mesas are in northern Arizona and represent over 1,500 years of corn farming by Pueblo people, with an average precipitation of 25 centimeters, or average, annual water year precipitation of 25 centimeters. That would really freak out any of your Midwestern farmers. This is a landscape of rocky mesas, sandy valleys, and what we call dune agriculture. People are practicing the same type of agriculture that we think ancestral Pueblo people practiced in the Four Corners region: direct precipitation, dry farming. So starting in 2006, our Pueblo advisory group at Crow Canyon, in association with Crow Canyon researchers and several other researchers from across the Southwest, came together and started the Pueblo Farming Project, which was to look at how the capabilities of Hopi corn and of Pueblo corn had been maintained over millennia by growing experimental gardens in the central Mesa Verde region at Crow Canyon, and eventually up in north of Dove Creek, elsewhere in southwestern Colorado. And our Hopi collaborators wanted to do this in the most traditional ways possible. And so, so Hopi farmers came to Crow Canyon over a 10-year period every single spring to help plant and to plant gardens using traditional practices, as we're being shown here, using a soya, a digging stick, to dig way deep in the soil, much deeper than corn is planted in the Midwest today, down to where the soil starts being moist, that moist layer. They plant 6 to 10 kernels. They cover it up with the moist soil first, and then dry soil that acts as a mulch, soil mulch. And as that corn grows, they plant in clumps. As that corn grows, that clump is thinned, and they plant in just this very traditional way. So the question was, in this landscape that's very different from Hopi today, Mesa Verde is very different from Hopi today, how would Hopi corn do? Well, we planted—
Hey, Kyle,
yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a moment?
Oh, sure.
We have a really good question that came in, and it's about the diversity of Hopi corn. And the question is, has the diversity of Hopi corn impacted the migration patterns and choice of where people chose to live and cultivate the crop? And was that a consideration in the analysis of the construction data that you mentioned previously that was with the concerning the tree cutting?
That is such a fantastic question. And I think the science is still out, but what I can tell you is that what we have learned from some of our Pueblo and especially Hopi collaborators is that the type of corn, when people wanted to migrate to Hopi, and throughout history, Hopi has been a place that welcomes communities. And one of the questions that people tend to be asked when requesting to migrate to Hopi has been, tell us about your corn. What does your corn do? How does it grow? What does it look like? And what is special about that corn? And that's been it's been a story that's come to the fore time and time again about people bringing that diversity into Hopi, and that diversity and all of those various uses and the importance of that corn is to this day very valued by people. So I think it's not only where the corn can grow, but it's that diversity for its own sake. It's respecting all of the various uses of that maize that has been important in the past. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. There was a great study by Karen Adams and Deb Muntrath looking at how all these different varieties of Southwestern corn flourish in the past, an experimental study. And those data have a lot to tell us about where corn might have flourished in the archaeological past. But I think there's a lot more work to do. That's just a fantastic question. So over 10 years, researchers in the Pueblo Farming Project planted corn. We would let it grow all summer. We tried to honor the way in which corn is cultivated in Hopi today. We weeded these gardens. We did not water the gardens. And then in the fall, Hopi farmers would give their time again, come back to Crow Canyon and to our gardens and help us with the harvest, when we would actually measure the growth of all the corn and the yield throughout the seasons. And as you can see in this picture, this is Paul Armaggiati holding up a beautiful ear of red corn. What we can see is that corn did really well in the Mesa Verde region. And this is really a fantastic result, because even though we have well over 1,000 years of people growing this corn in a very different environment on the Hopi Mesas, the capacity of that corn has been maintained to really flourish in the central Mesa Verde region. And this was an exciting result for our Hopi collaborators. Hopi maize flourishes in central Mesa Verde under traditional Hopi farming practices. Hopi maize also shows, as I said, that wide variability in traits, and those traits do change with different growing conditions. What we've been able to document over these 10 years has been how a couple of different varieties have been responding to these different growing conditions. Sometimes that has to do with the color of the corn. Sometimes it has to do with how large the corn is. So we've been getting ears, sometimes with up to 22 rows of kernels, where in other years we'll have the same seed stock and they'll make much thinner ears. We've been able to study how really local environmental conditions impact the growth of corn. One of our gardens is in the bottom of a valley, and we really documented how cold air drainage and other local factors were affecting that maize productivity. We also were privileged to do a genetics study as part of this, where we were able to document that Hopi maize is more diverse and than any other community's maize, and is unique. It's distinct from maize in many Southwestern communities. We've also, and this is a little bit nuanced, the Hopi maize that we analyzed in this study came straight from Hopi farmers who donated their maize. And we found that maize was genetically distinct from maize that had been gathered in the 1930s and has been grown out year after year in federal seed banks. So that's a really interesting finding, and we don't quite understand what it means so far. If you want to learn more about the Pueblo Farming Project, we've actually published an ebook on the results. It's got the history, the results, and educational resources, including 5 Colorado State Standards aligned lesson plans for middle schoolers. So check it out, crowcanyon.org/institute/PFP. Now I want to tell you about a project that we've just started, but I'm really excited about, and it's called the Maize Database Project. And this builds right out of the Pueblo Farming Project. Pueblo Farming Project was looking at corn that's grown at Hopi today. How well does it do in the central Mesa Verde region? And we found out it loves the central Mesa Verde region. But how do we document the diversity of maize and how that changed throughout the Pueblo occupation of the Southwest, and throughout history, the last 2,000 years when people were growing corn? Well, that requires us to go back into the archaeological record and look at corn. The problem is that this corn has been gathered over the last 100 years by archaeologists, and is in a lot of different places. It's in museums all across the country, all across the world. It's in some curation facilities. It's not well documented, so it's really hard to even know where to start. So last year, we got funding through the History Colorado State Historical Fund. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office and Crow Canyon got funding to establish the first ever comprehensive database of archaeologically curated maize, archaeologically collected maize. And you see our research team here. We've got Mark Varian, who I mentioned earlier. We've got Susan Sekakwaptawa, who's the USDA extension agent for Hopi on the left there. Stuart Koyamtawa, who is the head of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, and Jessica Lamawadama, who is a cultural specialist, traditional farmer, and incredible basket weaver at Hopi. We also have in the middle Sarah Owis, who is a paleoethnobotanist. Sarah studies ancient plant remains, and Kelly Swartz, who is the world's leading expert in ancient corn DNA. So this is a really cool group, and we're creating a database. So, so we're building the first ever comprehensive, publicly accessible database of curated ancestral Pueblo maize. We've contacted over 60 museums and curation facilities, and that number is growing every day. We want to assess connections between ancient maize and modern Pueblo varieties. We're determining criteria that specimens must meet in order to be appropriate for future analyses. And we're developing a research design for a large-scale multi-method analysis of ancient maize that answers questions that both archaeologists and Hopi people want answered about their corn. This has been a really collaborative process from the beginning. We started off by having everybody come up to Mesa Verde, join us, and go visit some facilities where maize is curated to learn about how maize is stored, the variability of objects and preservation conditions that corn is, in which that corn is stored, and have to start that conversation about what questions people have about corn in the past. We got to really dive into the collections, and were facilitated by incredible curators and collection managers who shared their knowledge with us and pulled some fantastic objects. And the preservation is really stunning. There is so much corn from the Southwest that is just really well preserved. We're in an arid landscape. A lot of the collections come from cave and alcove sites, so they're really protected against the elements. And where you think that that rodents would get in there and just eat all that maize up, no, it's really been protected. And often it's because Pueblo people were storing their corn in things like jars with lids on them that really protected them, right? So people weren't dumb, and they kept that corn for very long periods. We've got an incredibly diverse array of corn. So one of our questions is, when did all of these varieties, these colors of corn, and then you've got beans and squash down at the bottom there, when did those start being grown in different areas of the Southwest? And how quickly did different varieties or colors of corn that, again, are important for both ritual and culinary reasons, as well as subsistence, when did those start really coming to the fore of people's cultivation and agricultural strategies? Here we've got an example of a popcorn, a pop style corn, that was a very early style of corn in the Southwest. And we see that we've got corn that is sometimes gnawed by rodents or other processes on the left, sometimes charred corn. And we were having conversations with our analytical specialists about, what type of analyses can you do on a corn kernel that's been charred like the ones on the right. It ends up that you can't do ancient DNA on them, but you can learn a lot about the type of corn that was being grown, even from the charred bits. We also learned about some, strategies of sampling archaeologically in the past. You might look, if I were looking at these corn kernels, I would think, oh, well, maybe somebody with, a kid who had just lost some teeth or gnawing around the corner and doing something with these corn cobs. Well, that's not the case. These have been sampled for radiocarbon dating. And this is how corn cobs were sampled for this particular archaeological project in the past. And so it really helped our whole group to all be coming together and seeing the ways in which corn might have been treated, both in the deep past, but also by archaeologists and curators and other analysts in the present. Here's an example of one of those radiocarbon data sheets. This is Stuart analyzing some of the corn. What came to the fore as an interest that is of mutual interest for all of us is the development of different styles of corn for different cuisines, and especially flour varieties of corn that allowed for an explosion in Pueblo cuisine, including some neat bread making that occurs. So we're going to be diving into that part of the database as we move forward in this project. And the learning was going in all directions as we were visiting these museums here. Susan showing the different types of kernels that might have been important for different foods to Kelly. We learned how corn was stored in, like here at Mesa Verde, where it's stored in these rolling cabinets in compact storage. And so far, we've only gotten responses. We've only gotten data from 28 repositories and 2 individuals, but we have over 11,000 records of maize from across the Southwest and counting. These records will be available where appropriate to the public, and we'll be able to tell where and when that corn comes from too, and really establish our a good way to study these corn. One last thing at the bottom here, this is a unique object that shows up, well, no, it's not unique, it shows up all across the Southwest. It's shown up in many of the repositories where we found corn. It's usually labeled corn on a stick, right? To me, it reminds me of when you'd have a little tool to eat your corn on the cob. And so we were coming up with also, we archaeologists were coming up with all sorts of crazy reasons why this existed. Corn on a stick, maybe it was some special ritual object or so on. And then Stuart piped up, Stuart Koyamtua, the CPO, and said, well, no, it's actually a game. It's a dart game, and it's still played today by kids, where you sharpen a stick or a feather quill, you stick it in a corn cob, and you have a circle or a target on the ground, and you toss your corn dart, and you're trying to get it to stick into the ground in the target. So what we see here is an example of how we can come up with all sorts of fun ideas about the past, but really the most fun might be the game that kids are playing with this corn. So we're really excited to be doing this project. The final project that I want to talk to you about, and I know I'm running long, is a project that's really looking towards the future and looking at how communities in the Southwest and across the West can adapt given climate challenges that are coming down the road. It's called Native Waters on Arid Lands, and it's a collaboration between the Desert Research Institute, the University of Nevada, Reno, agricultural extension across the West and in Native communities, and the Canyon Archaeological Center to both convey climate information into communities and host discussions about climate challenges facing communities, but also to learn from communities so that scientists know what type of information we should be producing to be helpful to communities, or whether our help is needed at all. This is, again, a really large, multifaceted project, and I just want to share a couple of efforts from the project with you. And 3 people really stand out as important to these efforts. From the left, we have Maureen McCarthy, who is at UNR in DRI, and actually up here at the University of Montana now as well. We've got Beverly Ramsey, who was at DRI and is a Cherokee woman and incredible chemist. And we have Christine Albano, who recently got her doctorate from UNR, and is a hydrologist, atmospheric hydrologist. This team has been really looking at reading the changing seasons and learning from communities that have been doing this for millennia on these landscapes. People talk to us about how they've got their seasonal round. They know when planting is happening. They know when certain ceremony happens, and that those seasons are changing. They're experiencing those changes in their communities. And it's brought uncertainty into communities. And yet these are communities that have persisted on landscapes for very long times, and as we've seen in the Southwest, have persisted through a lot of changes. So what do? We work with communities to develop place-based climate information to help frame the changes that they've seen and are seeing and are going to see into the future. We work with communities to provide summer data on, say, warmer temperatures, drier, longer, hot summers, or on snowpack if they're really dependent on irrigation for agriculture, on the length of growing seasons and how that may change over time. And we do this on a community-to-community basis, where we're bringing those climate data that have been created by climate scientists and scaling them down to local communities so that communities can have conversations about those future impacts. We've been doing this through on-reservation climate resiliency workshops, where agricultural producers, farmers, and ranchers are coming together with extension specialists and climate scientists and having conversations about the impacts that they're experiencing on their landscape right now, and about the adaptation that that's going to be required in the future. We've hosted these all across the West, from Montana down to central Arizona. We're also hosting annual climate summits. We just had our 5th one in October, that bring together communities from across the West to Nevada to have discussions that really focus on learning, sharing stories, building trust, and sharing those stories of resilience from community to community where appropriate. I've gotten to take part in hosting and yet not really contributing to the sharing of these stories between traditional agricultural communities across the West. One thing that gets shared in these situations are experiences of native wisdom, from maize agriculture like we see there on the Hopi Mesas, to water management that honors traditional values on the Flathead Reservation, the Salish and Kootenai tribes, to a farming technique that's based on composting between agricultural rows, and was created with the buffalo dance in mind, about how natural processes, how the buffalo takes up grasses, digests them, composts them, digs them into the ground with their hooves, and how that creates vibrant ecological communities in the plains. How that can be translated into really resilient local agricultural and gardening practices. We've gotten examples time and time again that traditional practices are inherently sustainable and resilient. We see that from the long-lived nature of these communities. Traditional selection for drought-resilient corn, like we've been talking about, or reintroducing spiral mounds to conserve water, a really unique way of organizing a garden so that each plant is getting the exact amount of water that it needs, and it builds an ecological community that we see being reintroduced down among the Tohono O'odham, or protecting water supplies for native fish like they're having to do in terminal lakes across Nevada, like the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, or implementing hoop houses to protect crops, reduce water use, and extend the growing season like they're doing in Duck Valley. A spiral mound, I get a question here. A spiral mound is a way of organizing a garden that's literally a hill in a spiral shape. It sort of spirals up. You can think of it as a little mountain, right? And it's got a groove going down it. And along that groove, you plant different types of plants. You might plant the plants that need the most water, maybe down at the bottom where the water is going to end up. and the ones that maybe need a little less water up on top. And you water, you irrigate that, that garden from the top, and the water goes down that spiral, watering all of the plants along the way. It's a way of organizing a garden so that you're minimizing your water use. You're making the most of your water use by watering all of a big variety of plants that each have different water needs with one treatment of water. It's a really cool way of doing a garden. Google it, it's neat. And we've been having conversations with communities about vulnerability and resilience, and how especially agricultural resilience is essential for other types of cultural resilience. How agriculture and plants is a really good avenue to preserve language, native language in communities. How traditional values really build sustainability into community agricultural practices. We're really creating spaces, or we're trying to help create spaces to allow those conversations to happen. And we've been creating faculty to faculty research partnerships for tribal colleges and universities. So sharing between faculty at places like the University of Nevada, Reno, and at the Desert Research Institute, and faculty in this case at Ani Nakota College, where we created a community garden, and we're studying soil nutrients and different treatments for soils up on that reservation. So you can find out more about this project at nativewatersaridlands.com. We're coming to the end of this project, but it's not truly an end. We're spinning it off into many other initiatives, including working with teachers to do place-based environmental curricula for their classrooms, working more extensively with tribal colleges to facilitate networks between tribal colleges here in Montana, and continuing our close work with agricultural extension agents across the West. It's a really exciting initiative. So thanks for bearing with me over this talk. I just want to wrap things up with some observations that I think are pertinent, that empower people through understanding of the past, the present, and into the future. The first lesson that I think we should all take is that we can find common ground in stories of resilience. Some of those common stories that we see in the ancestral Pueblo case in the Four Corners are that diversification, mobility and migration, and social and trade networks really matter. It matters to community resilience, that sort of social interaction, that you're part of that community. And it matters, those values of the community matter for maintaining diversity of corn, and it matters that people were able to move to different places in the past when the time was right. I've learned that we need to acknowledge the sustainability that's all around us in traditional communities in North America and analog societies, traditional communities around the globe, where people are we've got plenty of evidence of local place-based resilience happening in small communities. And we need to be thinking about how to facilitate networks of knowledge exchange between those communities to help everyone subsist and thrive. And we can do that by being good allies and advocates to create spaces for community innovation. That innovation doesn't happen from scientists telling people what to do. It happens peer-to-peer. It happens about sharing values, sharing techniques, strategies for community resilience. I think we can find analogs between present communities. So asking questions like how Hopi cultivation practices might help other traditional corn farming societies across the Southwest that are maybe getting drier and are going to be more dependent on direct precipitation agriculture. And analogs with the past, looking to those past examples of resilience. What has been important in the past? And then always being allies in self-determination and processes of decolonization, of helping communities, or not even sometimes standing back and giving the space for communities to ask their own questions, because they've been here a lot longer than we have and have really flourished through some tough and good times. So I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to take questions for people as long as they want to hang out. Please visit crowcanyon.org to learn how you can get involved in these projects and many others through our programs, through volunteering. Also, I'm going to be taking a trip that focuses on this topic, hosting a trip called Climate and Culture in the Southern Rockies. And I really would love for you to join me. My friend Maureen McCarthy, who I mentioned earlier from the Native Waters Arid Lands Project, she's going to be co-hosting that with me, as well as many other wonderful scholars. We're going to be visiting communities across the Southwest and continuing this conversation, not only about how people in the past were resilient, but how communities in the future can be resilient given the climate challenges that we're going to face. You can always get in touch with me through email, on Twitter. I'm not super active. And then if you're into any of the geeky stuff that created any of the maps and analyses that you see here, I'm on something called GitHub. It's a lot of computer code, but if that's your thing, join me there. So I'll take questions. Thank you.
Hi, Kyle. We
Hi.
do have a question about trade networks.
Oh, good.
And so what we'd like to know is how far-reaching were these trade networks and who were people trading with?
That's a fantastic question, and it's something that we're continuously engaging with. There's a paper that's going to be coming out soon. Some researchers from Arizona State University and many other places ran a project called the Long-Term Vulnerability and Adaptation Project. I'm going to get that wrong. They're going to get mad at me. But what they've been looking at is the ways in which landscapes really impact the viability of mainly food trading networks. Okay, so it behooves me to create a trading relationship with you for perhaps a couple reasons. One might be that I want to have a relationship with you in some other ways. Maybe we've got an important ritual relationship, or maybe there's a marriage thing going on there, or maybe we're just looking for friends. But we might trade food as a way of signaling that. Another important aspect of food trade might be that we live in slightly different places. If I live in a high place, then maybe in a dry year, I might get a little more precipitation, a dry, hot year. And so maybe I'm going to do a little better and be able to grow more corn. If you're living in a low place, in a cold year, I might not do well in terms of growing corn, but you might do just fine, because in the Southwest, we tend to have this situation where cold years are a little wetter. So me and you might want to be trading corn so that in those warm years that are drier, I'm providing you with some corn. And in those cool years that are wetter, you're providing me with some corn. So what we're studying right now, and what the LTV-TP studied, is where on the landscape those types of trading relationships can really persist. And it varies pretty dramatically across the Southwest. What we're also finding is that people brought corn to certain places from very long distances. So some analyses of foodstuffs in Chaco Canyon, for instance, has shown that corn and other food has been brought in from very far places away. and has sort of bolstered an argument that that Chaco would have been perhaps a place of migration, a place of pilgrimage, perhaps a place of exchange. And so it really varies. For other types of exchange, which we can see a little more readily in the archaeological record, like pottery, we know certain types of pottery were made in certain places. We can look at the chemical elements of the actual paste, the pot itself, or of the pigmentation on it, and tell where it was made. Or sometimes we know that a certain type of pottery that's painted in a certain way or has a certain style of design on it is really local in terms of its production. But we almost always find some examples of that pottery showing up elsewhere. And we think that that's another example of long distance trade. And there's a great project by Matt Peoples and many others out of the Arizona State University that's really been diving into those long distance ceramic exchange networks. So it's an area of very active research. I can't answer your question directly. We don't know exactly how far people were trading, because it seems like it was really diverse in the past.
Thanks, Kyle. There's another question from Jane. Jane was asking, are there different varieties planted in distinct plots?
I can tell you what our Hopi partners have shared with us, and it's that yes, at Hopi, different varieties of corn are actually planted pretty far away from each other, and that's done so that you don't have a lot of hybridization between different varieties of corn. It maintains your white corn as white, and your blue corn as blue, and your red corn as red. And so that's another way in which communities are maintaining that phenotypic, the color diversity among their corn. It's not blending together. So yes, in that case, and I think it's an open question about how far back in time that goes, and what the values of ancestral people were when planting their corn. I think it's something that we're really interested in.
Nice, thank you. And then sort of related to that question, Jeff had a question about the maize planting style where there are 8 or 10 seeds planted, multiple seeds planted in the same location.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how many seeds actually emerge from that location, and would they not be competing with one another for scarcity of moisture in such arid environments? And to what extent would that approach be successful?
So that's a great question. What we've seen, and we actually measured this for all the gardens, we kept track of how many seeds were emerged from each plot, of how tall each of those stalks grew, and how many ears of corn they produced, if they produced any. And as I said, we were practicing to the extent possible Hopi cultivation practices. And one of the things that Hopi farmers do is they thin out those ears. So they're planting, I keep doing this because they actually keep the seed in their mouth as they're planting, and then they take some out and they put it into the hole and cover it with that moist soil. And they're planting about 10 seeds. Once the corn grows up to a certain height where their leaves are dangling over and touching the ground, they know it's time to thin that clump. And they thin it to the healthiest 5 to 6 stalks. So they do reduce the amount of competition among their corn, although I'm sure they wouldn't think of it in that way necessarily. But they're reducing that amount of competition among the stalks of their corn. That's how Hopi farmers have told us to do it today. I can't speak to exactly how those practices are in other societies across the Southwest.
Perfect. Thank you, Kyle. And the only other question is, at this time, is whether or not we will be posting this webinar to our website, and we will. We will also follow up with everybody to give them instructions on where to find that, but we will be posting that on our website. So stay tuned for more.
Yeah. Hey, I just want to thank everybody. This has been incredible. And you were guinea pigs for us. This was the first time we've ever done it. So I think you'll be getting an email, and we'd really love for your feedback on how this went, on how we can change the way we're doing this in the future. But we want to hold many more of these live webinars so that we can come to you from Crow Canyon. So, so please respond to that survey. I know it's just another survey in an era of surveys, but please respond to it. Let us know how we did and how we can improve. And I hope that we get to see you next time. Thanks for being here. Bye.